Hello again. One of the greatest and most popular of modern myths, and one which nobody likes to speak slightingly of, unless they find themselves accused of racism, is the idea that before Europeans came to Black Africa, that part of the continent which lies south of the Sahara Desert, great civilizations flourished there. We heard little or nothing about such places until 20 or 30 years ago, and then history and archaeology somehow, and regrettably, became tangled up with politics. This never bodes well. We remember how the Nazis created an entire, and entirely false, historical narrative about the supposed Aryans, and for the 12 years that the Thousand-Year Reich actually endured, nobody dared challenge the nonsense, because that was a sure path to trouble and a knock on the door in the middle of the night, followed by an uncomfortable interview with the Geheimstaatspolizei, more commonly known as the Gestapo. We have not yet reached that point, but even so, asking too many questions about black history is something likely to bring you into bad odour academically, and so most people avoid it. In short, we pay lip service to a nonsense for the sake of peace and quiet. Take the ruins of Great Zimbabwe. These are frequently described enthusiastically as the remains of a city, but they are, of course, nothing of the kind. There are no buildings of any description at all, just some dry stone walls, which weave drunkenly across the landscape, meandering uphill and down dale, with not a straight line or a right angle to be seen. It is true that there is what looks at first sight like a tower, but this is not a building either, but a solid pillar. Nobody could have lived in it, or indeed even have entered it. It's completely solid. The thumbnail to this video shows a piece of the dry stone walling about which such a fuss is made. It is not a brilliant production, considering that it was built during the Middle Ages, between roughly the time of the Norman conquest of England in 1066 and perhaps the time of the Wars of the Roses. Just for comparison, viewers might like to think about the kind of things being built in England at that time. Salisbury Cathedral, say, or Westminster Abbey. I'm no builder, but I am myself working on a dry stone wall at the moment, and I can assure viewers that it is considerably neater and more aesthetically pleasing than the walls of Zimbabwe. No mortar is used. The blocks of stone were roughly cut to shape and then simply piled one on top of the other in a fairly haphazard fashion. Such walls can last a long while, of course, as indeed these have. In the Lake District and also in Wales, there are dry stone walls like this separating fields, which were probably built about the same time as Zimbabwe, and they too are still standing. The people who lived in this part of Africa at that time lived in mud huts with roofs made of straw, just like most of the other people in sub-Saharan Africa. The concept of having a second story to a building simply did not occur to the ancestors of the Shona who lived here, nor to anybody else in Black Africa. Stone may have been used to build the odd wall, but it wasn't used at all for buildings to live in. For that, mud was the only medium used, just as it was in Britain during prehistoric times. All buildings were made of mud. There was one exception, and that is the Kingdom of Axum in modern Eritrea, but this was a culture which owed more to Arabs than it did Africans. It straddled the Red Sea at the point where all the trouble is currently occurring with the Houthi attacks on Western shipping, that is to say Bab al-Mandeb. 2,000 years ago, the Semites who lived in that part of the Arabian Peninsula crossed the Red Sea and established a colony in Eritrea. This is why the languages in that part of Africa, such as Tigrinya and Amharic, are very similar to Arabic and Hebrew. They're not African languages at all. Axum was actually an Arab kingdom. I'm aware that we all have to pretend that all manner of marvels emerged from Africa in ancient times, and that if only the white man had kept out, there is no knowing what wonders we might have seen. But the reality is that there was little to be found there other than mud huts and people living for the chief part as though they had not yet emerged from the Stone Age.